Hello, welcome to the Historians Hangout. My name is Alana Graves. I'm a master's student at Bowling Green State University, pursuing my second degree in history and a certificate in public history. This podcast hopes to bridge the gap between academia and the general public. Please sit back, relax, and come and enjoy history with us. So yeah, let's just get into it. Anything you want to say for a quick introduction?
My name is EK. I'm an amateur historian living in the UK. I have a master's degree in history, which I completed last year. And as you've alluded to, I run an Instagram account called It's Like History, which is kind of combining history and kind of an informational aspect, but very much with pop culture.
So how would you classify yourself as a historian, and why do you feel qualified to talk about today's topic?
So I think to me, like a historian is just somebody who spends their time researching history or learning about history. I'm not currently paid for my historical research, so I'm not, a professional historian, but I do strongly believe that if you are involved in studying history, you are a historian. I would definitely kind of classify myself as a public historian because I don't currently operate like in the academic side of things. And with my Instagram account, it's very much trying to make history accessible and, where appropriate, fun. A lot of kind of history is just pop culture of the past. So, you compare the Tudors to like the Kardashians. A lot of the stuff I've done on saints, especially like the Virgin Martyrs of medieval Christendom, are very like the Katniss Everdeen's, Buffy Summers of their generation. So why wouldn't they fit in modern memes? So my Instagram is kind of about embracing that while being informative. It's kind of like, those recipes for children where it's like you need to puree the vegetables into the pasta sauce so they don't realize that they're getting the vegetables, but they like it. And that's kind of, I'm sneaking in the educational aspects, whether you are learning whether you like it or not. And then in terms of kind of qualifications with history and also with this topic, if you want the technical answer, there's 2 bits of paper up there that say she can talk about this. I have my undergraduate and master's degree were both in history. I do not think that the skills to study history are exclusively found in academia at all, but it does kind of help. And any degree that you have, especially if it's what we would call a humanities, I think you call them like liberal arts degrees, it's teaching you how to research, it's teaching you how to present arguments, and that is the stuff you need to study history, whether or not it was actually the history was your kind of subject. And then I wrote my master's dissertation last summer on Margaret Tudor and her role as Queen of Scots. So if it's okay, I'll just introduce Margaret a bit because she's a secondary character in the Tudor story. So she was the eldest daughter of Henry VII of England and his queen Elizabeth of York, which means that Henry VIII was her younger brother. In 1503, she married James IV, who was the King of Scots, but in 1513, he was killed at the Battle of Flodden, and he was actually killed by an English army, her brother's army, under Catherine of Aragon, who was serving as his regent while Henry was in France, also doing war. Catherine, she wasn't on the battlefield or anything, but she went north with them. And according to her, she was going to send James's body to Henry in France, but everyone was like, please don't do that. So she just sent his bloodied jacket, which is also kind of weird, but I can't remember the exact wording, but it's something like, she wrote this letter: Henry, love you, just killed, was responsible for the death of our brother-in-law. I was gonna send his body to you, but then all of your nobles they wouldn't suffer it, like the English hearts wouldn't suffer for me to do this. I think it's probably a good thing. Well, we don't know where the body is now, though, I should say. We're not 100% sure where it ended up, but it didn't end up being sent to France because Catherine wasn't allowed. But Margaret and James had one surviving son at this point, and Margaret was actually pregnant when her husband was killed. And their son became James V. He was 17 months old. James IV, kind of the pivotal thing, is that James IV left Margaret designated as the regent for their son. But in 1514, in the summer, so just less than a year after, she was ousted by some of the Scottish nobles after she had remarried a man named Archibald Douglas, the 6th Earl of Angus. And that kind of signalled civil schemings, shenanigans, and backstabbing for the best part of the next 30 years. And my dissertation specifically looked at her in the 10 years of her as a consort to James IV, and then her role as a regent after 1513, how she was ousted from that. And then the central thing was, what role did gender play in those developments?
They are like the Kardashians, first of all.
fabulous analogy.
I always think about like when we look at this era and we think of people who they were really scholarly, they read Latin and Greek and plays and stuff, and it's like that was pop culture, the things they were reading. It is no different to us. You know, if you have someone, we very much kind of fetishize reading, I feel like today, and reading is great, but somebody who has watched, I don't know, 500 movies in a year, I think is kind of comparable to somebody in the 16th century having read a load of books, because that was the media of the time. And there's a lot happened, but in the end, they're just people. Why would they not react to things in the same way that we would? Why would they not kind of feel and have like the motivations that we do? So, you know, it's not always appropriate to kind of make fun of the stuff, but a lot of it is so good, which is good for me.
Said that she was going to send back his body. I was like, oh, she has the receipts.
Yeah.
She's ready to go. And I agree that I think we do really fetishize literature in that way. I worked on, I think messaged you about it, about nuns and pornography in early modern Europe. And everybody's like, oh, that seems really provocative. No, when the printing press came out, people would use it as propaganda. And so at the time, a lot of Protestants were printing Catholic nuns in pornographic situations to be like, they can't even control their women. And it's absolutely insane. And there were poems, and there was one poem about a man who saw a nun in a convent. He snuck in and had his way with her. He just ran off into the night. And everybody thinks that's going to be so poetic and beautiful because it's in French and it's from the 17th century. I'm like, no, they were just as foul as they are now. Like, they were messy.
I do feel like the Protestant propaganda, because of how it timed in with the printing press, I remember when I was like, basically, if you study history in the UK, you will learn about the Reformation in one way or another. Like, it was such a pivotal shift in European history. And I remember looking at pictures of, it was like woodcuts, and it was like demons pooping, and they were pooping out monks. And so it was like, this is where these Catholic monks come from. They come from devil's butts, I guess. And then there was one of some people farting at the Pope. I can't remember if it was meant to be specific people farting at the Pope, or it was more just, you know, general flatulence. But I do feel like it went hard in a lot of places, but I do feel like the religious propaganda went just all the way off.
It is my favorite thing. It's the modern deep fake, I guess.
Yeah.
The historical deep fake. Why is this research topic important to you?
So firstly, and this kind of applies to all my history knowledge, but especially Margaret, I am a huge gossip. I love hearing about drama and scandal, and studying royal women is the most acceptable academic way to do that. And if you want scandal, like, Margaret Tudor is your girl. I do think like a more serious answer is, in terms of women's history, we're going through kind of a watershed moment, a cultural reset, if you will, where we've already had kind of in the 60s onwards, the kind of shift towards cultural history and social history, and lots of these quite provocative arguments of like, women were there, by the way, and we're a little bit past that, but women have been placed back into the conversation. But I think we are currently having women being restored to kind of the central role that they played in history, including political history, and exploring kind of regencies and looking at the role that women played in governing countries. That's kind of an extension of that, and I think it's a good lens through which to reconsider kind of the dynamics of power and reinsert gender into that. And I say reinsert because, like, this is not some ahistorical alternative history. We're not shoehorning figures and elements that weren't there in the first place. We know these women were there, and it's ahistorical to kind of argue otherwise, in my view.
As someone who also studies women and gender, I feel like right now there's another wave of feminists coming through history we kind of see it. I don't know. I want to say early modern is a place where a lot of feminists currently that I know are studying, but then I like that I'm seeing the field go back even farther into ancient history. These gender studies by my peers is making me feel that finally my research is becoming validified because I'm seeing all these people actually want to know about, oh, why were queens doing this? Or what was the everyday woman doing? And the story of even the average people from prostitutes to nuns, people are genuinely becoming interested and included now with women.
Yeah.
So.
And I feel like we're on that next step of things. We're we're almost like we're beyond what I would maybe the BuzzFeed listicle era, where it was like, look at all these women that existed. That's cool and true and important, but it's like, okay, and next, where do we go next? And it's interesting you saying about how the early modern world is having that, because I would say the medieval scholarly era is also having that. So I kind of straddle the two, because I tend to do later, high to late medieval, and then up to the end of the 16th century, which in Scotland, it's kind of a bit complicated. I have been told on Instagram that actually the medieval era ended in 1500, and I have to point out that in Scotland, things took longer to get there, okay? It's further up. It's a long way. Not to mention, obviously, the periodization is completely arbitrary in some ways and very flexible. But with Scotland, 1513, the Battle of Flodden is sometimes used as like the end of the medieval period in Scotland, but also, and I lean on this kind of criteria because it benefits me, but 1560 was when Scotland became Protestant, so it was a long time after England did. So 1513 is sometimes considered the capstone, but I tend to go with 1560, especially because, and I think the early modern exemplifies this, it's not like everybody woke up one day and was like, right, no more of that era. This isn't Taylor Swift's albums, okay? It was not so clearly delineated. I have no idea what era we will be categorized in, whether we'll be kind of lumped in more with the 20th century, or is this the beginning of kind of another era. But yes, I know, isn't it shocking, a woman on the internet being told that she's wrong about something? Say it isn't so.
You wrong on your own Instagram account with your own degrees that you earned in your own field?
I mean, yeah, what do I know?
Oh gosh, which is absolutely insane as well. Not only is this your specialty, you also live there. Any historian, I would argue, knows that, yeah, certain events really define an era or define a decade, but nobody's going to be like, we're no longer in the 20th century.
Yeah, it's like, that's not how it works now. The example I always give to people is that probably in 500, 600 years, World War I and World War II will probably be considered one thing, possibly the Cold War as well, and they'll just be called something like the 20th century wars, the same way we did with the 100 Years' War, which wasn't even 100 years, the Wars of the Roses and stuff. It's all kind of projected back, so who knows where we will kind of fall on that.
I completely agree. There's no way that we're not including, for American history, 9/11 in the long 20th century. There's no way that that is not going to be a defining point. And also with COVID and different pandemic eras, wildfires and everything, either that's going to be the start, I think, of a new era, or else it's definitely going to be lumped into the long 20th century.
Yeah, 100%. Especially, I think, because like as a millennial, the defining feature of being a millennial is that it was when there was the millennium and we went into this new kind of thing. It's funny, I was born in 1993, and when I find a historical figure who was born in the late 90s of that century, I'm always like, oh, they're existing just like me in this liminal space and we're kindred spirits. I think Hildegard of Bingen is one, and I'm like, she's basically the 12th century version of a millennial.
What is your methodology, and if you could provide a brief explanation of methodology?
So whenever people say, what do you study? I haven't actually seen it, but the most recent adaptation of Little Women, there's a bit where Saoirse Ronan says women and does this, and I just send them that gif. It's like, put that at the top of my CV. With my thesis and kind of the work I was doing in the kind of last half of my master's degree, I kind of went with the overall question of how did gender and power impact Margaret Tudor, both pre and post being widowed. And to do that, I kind of used two methodologies in a way. So I divided the thesis chronologically, having chapter 1 focusing on Margaret between 1503 and 1513, and then the second chapter going from September of 1513 to her fleeing Scotland in October of 1515. Originally, I was like, oh, I'll do like the rest of her life. No, bad choice, bad decision that I abandoned very quickly. And I do know what happened in the rest of her life, but sometimes when people ask me about it, I'm like, 1524, after 1515, it gets a little bit repetitive for a start. But with that first chapter, my methodology was mainly kind of comparative. I was looking at how Margaret's counterparts elsewhere in that period in Western Europe, how they kind of acted. So Catherine of Aragon, obviously her sister-in-law, Margaret's mother, Elizabeth of York, and Margaret's grandmother, Margaret Beaufort, who has incredible scholarship done about her and was a real powerhouse of the kind of tail end of the Wars of the Roses. And then I also looked at Margaret of Austria, Duchess of Savoy. So she was the daughter of Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I and Mary, the Duchess of Burgundy, and Margaret's brother Philip, known incredibly misleadingly as Philip the Handsome. You know, when people talk about the Habsburg appearance, this is where it was starting to make itself known. But Mary, Duchess of Burgundy, they're one of the kind of main portrait of her. She was very, very beautiful, but you know, genetics, I guess, when your family tree is a circle. So Margaret's brother Philip inherited a ridiculous amount of territory in Europe when their parents died, including the Netherlands, and Margaret first served her brother by ruling over the Netherlands, and then Philip's son Charles, who became Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. So Margaret was very much an integral part of the Habsburg machine that dominated both Western Europe in this period and then the kind of burgeoning Spanish Empire in the Americas. I also looked at Anne de Beaujeu, who was a French princess, and she was the sister of Charles VIII of France, and she served as his regent, and also Marguerite de Navarre, who supported her brother Francis I of France when he was king, and Marguerite and Francis's mother, Louise of Savoy. And I think kind of the key thing, I have to kind of define some things first briefly. And it's kind of like we said about periodization being arbitrary. Some of these definitions are kind of arbitrary, but they worked for me. So essentially you have queen regents, which is a woman who was a queen, usually through marriage to a king, and she is put in charge of the country on behalf of the actual monarch, who is almost always male, and very often it's that the king is underage and that the queen regent ruling for him was his mother. But you did also get examples of other female royal women acting in this capacity who weren't queens at all. They weren't ever queens, but they're usually related closely to the monarch, usually a sibling. So with Marguerite de Navarre, Anne de Beaujeu, and Margaret of Austria. And they're often ruling on behalf of that relative who is otherwise indisposed. So with the Duke of Burgundy, with Philip, it was just, there was too much land and it was like, you need to go and take care of this. And then Anne de Beaujeu's brother was underage. Margaret Tudor, it was her son who was underage. And then Marguerite of Navarre and Louise of Savoy helped Francis, I think maybe when Francis was at war. I don't know, it kind of all blurs into one. But they're not obviously queen regents and the terms are not interchangeable, but they fulfill very much a similar role. And then the kind of confusing thing about queen regent is that it sounds very similar to queen regnant, which means a queen ruling in her own right. So in England, since the Norman conquest, we've had 5 of them: Mary I, Elizabeth I, Mary II, who always gets forgotten because she was ruling alongside her husband/cousin, William III, and Victoria, and then Elizabeth II. In Scotland, prior to the union of the crowns in 1603, they had 2. So Margaret of Norway, who died before she got here and she was like 10, and then famously Mary Queen of Scots. But my focus of my research has been the regencies, not the people who are ruling in their own right. So with the second chapter of my thesis, it was this chronological division. So taking up the action in September of 1513, when Margaret became part of the government as widow of James IV and mother of James V. Margaret was not the first widowed queen consort to serve as a regent for her son in Scotland. So I was very much kind of talking about them. In the 15th century, we had Joan Beaufort and Mary of Guelders. Joan was the consort of James I of Scotland. He was assassinated in 1437, and Joan was kind of part of the government ruling on behalf of her son James II, who was 6. And then Mary of Guelders, who was the consort of James II once he'd grown up, he died after a cannon exploded next to him in 1460. And so their son James III became king at the age of 8 or 9. The kings of Scotland in this period had this undeniable tendency to just die. There were so many regencies. James I technically came to the throne as a minor, but then he was imprisoned for 20 years. It was a whole thing. James II after his father's assassination, James III after the explosion, James IV, he was 15, so, and he kind of just ruled in his own right, but his dad was deposed and then died, and then obviously James IV died. So whoever in Scotland was making child-sized crowns in this era was making a killing. So but kind of to explore their regencies and kind of Margaret's as well, the question that underwrote it all were, here are the factors that contributed to her being given the regency. Here are the factors that kind of underwrote her being deposed and ousted from the regency. Were these factors influenced by gender? And the answer, spoiler, was yes.
So as you're studying women and culture, gender, sexuality, do you also find yourself doing a political history throughout this era? Because it's easy to follow along with the regency and the different politics that come through, whether each dynasty leans towards Catholicism or Protestantism. I was just wondering about your methods in connecting the legality and the social structures together to the regions of the time.
It's kind of like, so I think one of the classes I did for my master's was in England, but it was sources on women in late medieval England, and it was looking at massively just social stuff. And so I think I was able to build up a context of how it was in a more social sense, and then looking at more kind of specific instances. And I've kind of talked about it later with the public-private dichotomy, and I think that is kind of reflective of a political versus social dichotomy, if that makes sense, because especially with these kind of elite women, their household was a political institution. Their servants, their ladies in waiting, their grooms, all of their, the wardrobes, everything, their entire thing was part of, if not like the government in a traditional sense, it was part of the political machine of the monarchy. So I think it's one of those things. I think if you come into it being like, I'm just going to focus on the social, or I'm just going to focus on the political, it might be a bit tricky. I think you kind of end up straddling it a bit. And that, I think, is because of coming at it from a gender perspective. Already, when you're studying women's history, especially further back, you're already geared into like, I'm going to have to read against the grain. I'm going to have to find these incidental details that have slipped through the cracks by kind of, like Victorian era historians. And you're already kind of, you're up against it. So you are already in the mindset of, I'm going to have to be a bit creative with how I explore this. And so then you're able, it's a tricky balance, but I think it can be found there.
Yeah, and I think that really answers actually question number 4. What lens did you use to analyze your topic and explanation of historiography? You're going through gendered history and you're looking at social expectations and trying to find that balancing act between, for women, for gender, for popular culture studies. So really, really integrated in that. I would love to read if you are publishing anything soon. Would be very interesting.
It's interesting you saying about how coming at it from like always considering gender as an underlying factor, because I think one of the things that appeals to me about studying stuff from a gender perspective is that you are looking at what kind of gender norms are at play and how they are being negotiated and exploited and rejected. The idea that everybody just accepted gender norms. The Bible says this, or this publication says this, or this law says that, and we agree that sounds good to me. That's never been true. People have always played with gender and rebelled against it, remodeled it and used it. And I think in terms of exploiting it and using it, we see very, very clearly amongst elite women, especially those who were operating within the highest level of government in their own way. And the other kind of, it is gender, but it's kind of pushing it. It's a slightly different tack where it's looking at power versus authority, which in queenship studies is kind of the zeitgeist of kind of the last few decades, where the idea is that power is influence, it's the ability to get things done, whereas authority is the publicly acknowledged right to have that power, to be in this position where everyone's like, yeah, we have to do what he says, so a monarch. And royal women were not afforded authority except in extenuating circumstances, so a regency. But regardless of that, they always had access to some kind of power, some influence, whether that was kind of backdoor dealing, whether that was networking, kind of connecting with different courtiers and nobles. And they were in that position because of their gender, because they were the king's sister or mother or other kind of relative. I mean, male relatives of the king would also have this kind of access and would probably have some form of authority, especially if they held a dukedom or something. But women, these royal women, were holding it in a very specific way, and it depended on their gender. And this is kind of a rejection of that public-private dichotomy. It's becoming very old-fashioned, the idea that you had a public political sphere dominated by men and then a private domestic sphere, exclusively the realm of women, and that realm was kind of relatively unimportant with no political ramifications. That's just absolutely not true. And we are currently getting these incredible re-evaluations of different women, including Margaret.
So, at one point, I was doing a research project on what we would refer to as the first female husbands. I think a lot of times people would lump them into queer history as being trans, but as you know, as historians, we can't put modern conceptions of gender and sexuality onto a past society or people that wouldn't necessarily understand or have that concept yet. But what we see is people that were lower class, lower authority, they had more of an ability to play with gender and their sexuality because people didn't necessarily care about what they were doing. And then as these female husbands became more predominant and rose the social economic ladder, that's really when we are able to see people having problems with their gender and the authority that came along with it. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see at the end of this episode what Margaret does with her power and authority linked to gender.
Not only her gender, but also the roles that she was expected to play, and then the roles that she was able to achieve with her power. So I'm very excited to get into all of that. But going off of that, what are other historians saying about your topic?
So with Margaret specifically, people are very mean about her traditionally, not so much at the moment, but, and by people I do mainly mean men. She gets written off as hysterical and stupid and vain and very fickle, and this idea that she tried to destroy Scotland by kind of signing it over wholesale to the English. She's almost treated as kind of like a fifth column element in that, despite the fact that the thing about Scotland, the thing about medieval Scotland is it will always be in a triangle between France and England. Like, that is the defining characteristic. So in 1296, France and Scotland agreed to something called the Old Alliance. And basically it was like, I'll back you against England if you back me. And that went from 1296 all the way up to the mid-16th century. It was renewed by every French monarch except one. I think it was like a Louis IX. I don't know what his deal was. He was just like, no, I'm not about that. But every other monarch renewed it. And so when people talk about like, oh, France and Scotland and England were always at war, they were, but France was also very much involved. You see it referenced in memes around football tournaments. So it will be like, if England's football team is playing France, Scotland will back France, and it's like the old alliance is being restored. Because of this balance, Scotland almost always had a pro-French faction and a pro-English faction. It wasn't just Margaret, there were other pro-English nobles, and, you know, those kind of allegiances chopped and changed depending on personally who was going to benefit from them. But I think there has been a big push for more Scottish history in kind of the late 20th century and today, with kind of increasing nationalism. And so Margaret's kind of dismissed as like, oh, she was kind of betraying Scotland, etc. And so, yeah, she has not really been given a fair shot by some historians. There was one I remember who had written that Margaret had kind of a string of disastrous romantic liaisons after her husband James IV died. And like, she had two. She had two. She married in 1514 to Archibald Douglas, and then they eventually got divorced, and then she remarried to a man called Henry Stuart. Both didn't end really well. Like, she fell out with Henry Stuart as well in the end. But I think, given the string of disastrous romantic liaisons that were happening south of the border at that point, Margaret looks like a nun in comparison. So it's very much like, it's you can tell what the historian is actually trying to say, and it's like, you're not actually coming at this you're not really giving her a fair hearing. You're just being like, no, she was the worst. We do have some kind of more recent scholarship, including mine, I guess, that reevaluate Margaret. There is a PhD thesis and some work by a historian called Helen Newsome, and she does like linguistic analysis. So she's looked at Margaret's correspondence, and her kind of overall vibe, which I agree with, is that Margaret she was doing the best with what she had. She made poor choices, she made okay choices. Some of the poor choices are very justifiable. So her remarriage to Archibald Douglas, she was 23 when she was widowed. She was initially pregnant and then had her son, but he unfortunately died when he was a child. And then she had her son, the king, James V. She had lived in Scotland for 10 years, but like when she got to Scotland, she was 13. She was kind of on her own. Why wouldn't she remarry to a powerful noble while she was trying to kind of carve it out? I think because she married Archibald for love, and it didn't go well, it's like, well, it was a stupid decision. She's an idiot. She doesn't know what she's doing. Yeah, it wasn't the best decision. Like, she turned out to be a bit of a wrong-un, but I can understand why she did it. And then we do have some work on kind of earlier Scottish queens, so Joan Beaufort and Mary of Guelders, who I mentioned, but it does kind of dry up a little the further back you go. Like, there isn't really enough scholarship, full stop, on Scotland's consorts in this period. We don't really have enough of a picture of kind of elite women in this period, which is why I ended up, methodologically speaking, leaning on these kind of Western European counterparts as well.
Yeah, thank you. And going back to a popular culture reference, I see a lot of historians before this wave of feminism comes through our set of, I would say, new historians.
Yeah.
Who are writing through it, is they were really taking into account like body counts of queens. And you just kind of sit there like, okay, well, could you compare it at the same time as other male monarchs?
Yeah,
right now, who have multiple lovers and multiple consorts that didn't work out or that were horrible choices.
Well, it's like, if you are gonna accuse any monarch or any kind of royal person in this period of being like, oh, they had loads and loads of relationships, I would not pick the sister of Henry VIII. Because the other thing you get is that Archibald Douglas was much younger than her. It is almost certain that they were the same age. They were born in the same year. We don't have a definitive date on Archibald's date of birth, but her birthday is in November. So the chances are he was older than her. And it's like, the next husband was younger. But I'm like, how does that diminish her at all? But I think it's just them trying to be like, oh, she just did what she wanted. She wasn't taking into account political stuff. Well, first of all, she kind of was. And also, it's very much scraping the barrel.
How did you decide on your thesis?
So I couldn't decide on anything at first. Like, I knew I wanted to do Queens and I knew I wanted to do medieval Scotland. But it was actually my supervisor who said, what about Margaret Tudor? And I have always been a fan of her, so I did feel a little bit stupid for not thinking of it. But I was like, yes, genius idea. And kind of all's well that ends well. I knew I wanted to come at it from this power versus authority angle. I have found that in kind of the study of medieval women in Europe, you come up against this kind of truism that all women from that period were very uniformly oppressed, subjugated, ousted from meaningful positions, completely erased from public life, and just marginalized in every kind of conceivable aspect. And like Margaret Tudor, medieval Europe was an intensely patriarchal environment, and that combined in with kind of like the religious hegemony and feudal system that still existed. But that doesn't mean that there were no women in positions of power, because I always compare it to today. Like, women are marginalized in much of the world today. Misogyny is very much still going strong, but women still occupy positions of incredible power, and they will often, either to get there or when they are there, perpetuate that oppression themselves. So we were talking about kind of on the lower end of the scale. With the lower end of the scale today, like the regular people, us, we're kind of still thriving where we can, and we're trying to carve out something for ourselves and fighting back against misogyny and kind of organizing for women's rights and women's wrongs. But none of that negates the fact that today is a patriarchy. It doesn't mean that, oh, it's some like feminist egalitarian utopia. It just means that even within kind of patriarchal strictures and oppressive structures, even when marginalized, people survive and they thrive. And if you just come up against this belief like, oh, it was patriarchal and therefore women had no kind of importance or value to their contemporaries, and if you just accept that as kind of the final word, it's a very limiting view, and you are shutting the lid on so much incredible scholarship potential. And so I think with my research and with my thesis, I wanted to go beyond that. I had a question. No, it wasn't a question, it was a comment. Probably, I don't think it was a rude one, to be fair, but it was a comment on an Instagram video saying about how, I was saying about how medieval queens were important. And somebody commented like, oh no, kings didn't value their daughters at all. And obviously we know, rules about primogeniture means that it was preferable for kings in this context to have a male heir. Princesses were still incredibly valuable. Even if you're coming at it from a completely cynical perspective, they were incredibly valuable in terms of marital alliances and perpetuating dynasties, not to mention that kings were still real people and they had real emotions and emotional attachments. Not all kings, but they weren't all Henry VIII. Not every monarch was absolutely losing their mind because they had a plethora of daughters. They were still useful. And then I think what you were saying about how the further up the ladder you got, the gender became more restricted. In my experience of researching this, the further to the top you get, the more you rely on gender and the more you rely on exploiting it, because with these, especially with Margaret Tudor as regent, her being the regent of Scotland was entirely predicated on the fact that she was a woman, that she was the widow of the last king and that she was the mother of the next. That was it. That was the complete basis for her regency. So it completely makes sense to me that lower down in classes there would be a little bit more flexibility, but when you're getting to this kind of high political sphere, they're exploiting it. They're exploiting gender for their own purposes, which is kind of how you end up with them perpetuating oppression as well. It's kind of like girlboss feminism, but for the medieval period, whereas, well, I'm doing great, so I'm fine with this patriarchy thing, actually. And then maybe further down, they were like, well, it's not really working for me, so...
Yeah. Did they own their own Mojo Dojo Casa house? They did. Does everybody get their own Mojo Dojo Casa house, though? No.
Exactly.
So I believe that was a beautiful analogy, and I think that leads very well into what primary sources do you feel are most relevant to this research, especially when you were talking about how queens were able, or queen regents were able to gain their power through gender, being either a mother or the daughter of a king. You kind of see in different gravestones saying like, this was a mother, daughter, wife, and then missing a name up until, I can't think of the year. But I was wondering if there was something similar to that when talking about queens. Were they really defined in material items such as headstones or...
Yeah, I think it's... So in terms of sources that were like relevant to Margaret, we're very lucky that we have a lot of her correspondence. It's not super widely available. Some of it is in Latin and a lot of it is not yet digitized, but there's a few dozen floating about, which we kind of have Henry VIII to thank for, because there's, in the 16th century, the details as why this happened, but we have loads of the state papers from the 16th century. I guess Henry VIII and his secretaries were like, well, someone will need this one day. and I needed it. So thank you very much to them. Most of the letters that we have that I used were towards when she was serving as regent. There are ones from when she was consort, including some very rude ones to her brother, because when their brother Arthur died, he left money, I think jewelry, to his sister, and Henry wouldn't send it on. And Margaret sends this amazing letter where she's like, I can't think why you wouldn't send forward the inheritance, which we both know that I am entitled to. Surely you don't hate your sister. The most passive aggressive thing, just absolutely perfection. And you do kind of see, I feel like, in terms of your question about how these women were defined and things, in terms of the relationship as sister of Henry VIII, I think obviously her relationship with him and with England was very much dependent on her gender, as being kind of, that was her natal family, and then she ended up having her marital family. But she was such a force to be reckoned with that I do not think, she could never be a placeholder. She was too, I don't want to girl boss her, but she was pretty brutal at times, including to him, in fact mainly to her brother. I think their relationship certainly was always very individual, and I think part of that is because we have all of this correspondence from her. There's a historian called Mary Ann Everett Green from the 19th century, and she published a few edited collections of papers and sources to do with these women. She did one that was called Letters of the Princesses of England or something, and it basically is a bunch of letters, and it's to various queens and princesses, so you get quite a personalized view of their relationship to these men, which I think that's kind of the benefit with studying it as queens, is there's some of them, there's not a huge amount of primary source information, but generally it will be more than kind of in the lower ranks. And then you definitely get a gendered picture of her importance being so gendered during her wedding and like the lead up. So we have a primary source by a herald who was called John Young, and he accompanied Margaret on her procession. She went on this really elaborate journey all the way from London up to Edinburgh in 1503. And Young wrote a full account of it, and it was several months of being entertained in all these different towns and visiting different churches and religious sites and sitting through religious ceremonies and meeting kind of local nobles. And it was just this dazzling train of Tudor majesty, because it was the ultimate PR spectacle for a dynasty that was still in its first generation. She went up there when her father was still alive, Henry VII. So it was that first, after the Battle of Bosworth, it was the first Tudor monarch. And then Young also covers Margaret meeting James, and then the wedding itself on the 8th of August, I think, 1503, which included her coronation and the wedding celebrations. In Young's account, he talks about when they enter their entry into Edinburgh, which was like this huge elaborate thing. There are plays and pageants as they kind of ride past being performed, and there's one of the Annunciation. And then in a book of hours that was gifted by James IV to Margaret, there is a portrait of her kneeling, and in front of her on an altar, two little statues that are acting out the Annunciation. And then there's poems by a guy called William Dunbar, and he wrote a few poems referencing the couple. He wrote one called The Thistle and the Rose, which is quite famous. Scottish people, like Scotland, loves poetry. They are obsessed with it. You can't write a dissertation on medieval Scotland without putting some poetry in. It's against the law. And that poem specifically was produced for the wedding, but then he wrote another poem about, I think it was in like 1509, and it was to mark Margaret visiting Aberdeen. And in that, she sees, I'm pretty sure, a play of the Annunciation. So it's very much all these things being, hey, Margaret, so remember when Mary, who is considered the Queen of Heaven, remember when she had a baby and it was super important and kind of, brought about the redemption of man, and now we are all saved? Yeah, so maybe take inspiration from that. And if you could give lots and lots of children to your king, your husband, that would just be tip top. So you've got this, her role is being defined in terms of her gender. Like, it could not be clearer, especially since she was quite young, and I don't think, it's not 100% sure if that was her first pregnancy, But when she had her first child, she had a few children that unfortunately didn't survive, but it was a little bit later. So like nothing had happened in the early kind of years of her marriage. We also get treasury accounts that show royal expenditure, and they show everything from kind of the wages and supplies for Margaret's household, as well as Christmas gifts from the king. And then for the second part of it, we have minutes from the Royal Council of Scotland that served under Margaret as regent between September 1513 and August of 1514. And it makes extensive reference to her as being kind of named as, it tends to get described as testamentary tutrix meaning like governor, guardian type thing, and then testamentary literally meaning from the will and testament. She's been left in this position by her husband, and it cannot be clearer that you are here because you are the mother and the widow now, but before your role was as consort. And then kind of the final source, there were other sources as well, but one of the sources that was more distant to Margaret was Christine Tibazan's Treasure of the City of Ladies, which is an early 15th century conduct manual written by a woman, Christine, who was at the court of Charles VI of France, and it was aimed at royal women generally. We don't know for sure, there's nothing to suggest that Margaret 100% read this, but it was known in England and it was known in Scotland at that time. So I was able to use it to kind of say, like, this is how women were very often, princesses were, this is how they were expected to act. And there's a lot of discussion in that book about widowhood and how to kind of raise your children after you've been widowed. So I was able to kind of use that as context for the decisions that she made.
How is this topic significant throughout history?
This research is not going to change the world. I'm not bringing about some kind of paradigm shift in historiography, but that's okay. Margaret herself was significant. So because of her Tudor lineage, her great-grandson James VI of Scotland was able to succeed Elizabeth in 1603, which obviously completely changed the fate of England and Scotland. And Margaret is the ancestor of every monarch since. But like, she's not that important. This isn't going to change the world. But I think we should embrace learning for learning's sake. There was a podcast I listened to a couple of weeks ago. I think it was talking about medieval cathedrals. And the historian said, I wrote this down, they said, there is not enough emphasis perhaps on following the scholarship that just really lights you up. And I just think we're allowed to research stuff that isn't groundbreaking and spread the word around kind of niche or even silly stuff. I've been doing lots of research in kind of next steps of academic journeys, and you can tell when a guide for your application is aimed at humanities students versus not, because they're like, you need to show how this has impact different communities. I'm not like doing chemical engineering, like nobody cares. I'm not going to change the world by being like, oh, do you want to hear about some saints and some queens? It's not going to happen, but that's fine. It's good. Just let people enjoy things.
Let people enjoy things, let them research nonsense and have a good time.
Yeah, 100%.
I would like to just disagree with one little thing. I think that your research and your presence online has changed the way that I personally do history.
That is so, yeah, my goodness.
I really enjoy the way that you do it and how you draw it into public history. And I really would like to be a historian that pulls not only my friends into this journey of my capstone, but other outsiders into learning about history and learning about their surroundings in a way that's educational, but also fun. I think a lot of times our institutions are so focused on getting people in the door, but they forget that our generation has a 15-second times. This is what I'm going to pay attention to. If you don't draw me in now, you're never going to get me in. And a lot of times they're still working on this way that's, yeah, this is the trend, but we know that people are going to come in just to look at this. And I don't think that they are. And so after I stumbled upon your account, I was like, oh, this is the way that I want to do history now. I want to engage people that are my own age. I want to influence future generations. I wanted to let you know that I disagree. I think that your research is really important.
It's very much like it's ours. We have a space in history that we are entitled to take up and to there is room for everybody. And so I feel like we're in that position where, you know, we've sat down at the table and we're elbowing to like, no, I need more room, back off. My friends are coming, they're on their way. Sorry, I'm saving that seat kind of thing. We're allowed to enjoy it. And I think that is when you get pushback to that, a lot of the time, you know, I'm no longer a teenager, but it's very much that like, oh, teenage girls are interested in this, therefore it's not serious. I don't want to pander to that idea. I shouldn't have to be serious. To be taken seriously, I don't have to be kind of stern and doing it according to like the academy. And then if you think about it, it's kind of a bit of a full circle moment, because if you think about the Enlightenment era and Victorian era scholars, they were super rich people doing it for fun. It was a much more of an amateur thing. So it's like, well, why don't we get to do that? Why do we have to have kind of university accreditation position in institutions to be a part of scholarship? You know, we may not be in academia, but we are in scholarship, and it's ours for the taking.
What advice would you give to someone who is interested in the topic of your research?
So passion is 9/10 of the law, and I use law, LORE, law, because if you are not passionate about something, it's going to be rubbish. Like, you're not going to enjoy yourself. If you are interested in it, then you are halfway there. If, you know, thinking practically, if you're going to research anything in depth, you need to be interested in it, whether that's like a summer, like my dissertation, which was over several months, or like a PhD project, which is over several years. So my advice would be to nurture that passion. And that includes consuming stuff on social media. That includes fiction books, I'm afraid, David Starkey. No, enjoy historical fiction. Take it with a pinch of salt, but you should really be doing that with nonfiction as well. Go and visit places, watch films, watch documentaries, and lots of different documentaries, you know, not just one institution. Read, obviously. And if you can, try and get hold of some academic journals or kind of monographs. It can be difficult, but it's not impossible. And I do think people would be surprised at the difference between how academic history is presented in the mainstream versus how it actually is. I feel like it is the responsibility of academics to represent the academic world in the public conversation. So I think we need to all commit to that. A lot of the kind of the discourse, even if you can't get hold of that stuff, like, don't feel like an imposter. Don't feel that you're not as good as other people.
I really enjoyed your point about learning history and reading history for fun. I think one of the first books I read that got me into history outside of the Percy Jackson universe of ancient gods and goddesses was a book called Storm and Silence by Robert Thayer. And he has footnotes throughout his book. It's written by a historian.
Wow! That's gold.
Absolutely amazing. It is so cute and just a lighthearted thing, but throughout the footnotes I started clicking on them and be like, oh my god, like suffragettes did so much, and he goes into colonialism. So whatever facet the viewers or listeners, whoever's going through this, whatever facet you enjoy, just poke around it. It's okay to start in a book. It's okay to start on Wikipedia, as long as you just
100%.
follow the links. Yeah,
just follow the citations, follow the money kind of thing.
So last question of the pre-made ones. Any comments that we have not covered in this interview that you want to point out, or any advice that you want to hit before we get into the Instagram poll questions?
I don't think so. I talked about the methodology stuff, talked about the historiographical stuff, and I think with the Instagram questions, there's some good stuff about what being a Queen Regent meant. So yeah, I'm happy to just kind of go into that bit.
Perfect. Okay, so the first one.
Oh yeah, sorry, I should have said about this. Because some of the questions have like similar answers, I kind of reorganized them in the order, because some of them I'll go on to it. So I had as the first one of where did the idea of Queen Regents originate, and then I had the second one as information about lesser known regents, and then the third one, how successful were they in longevity, and then the fourth one, did they have any control over their marriage, because it dominoes a little bit.
Perfect. Let's go with the way that you've organized it, and you can just go off.
So with kind of Queen Regents, they existed in lots of different contexts, and I think one of the key parts is that some of them were specifically designated, like this is the regent, so Margaret Tudor, but that wasn't always done formally, and not having that official title did not preclude kind of involvement in politics. So Margaret of Anjou, for example, she was very, very involved in the rule of her husband, Henry VI, in the 15th century. And she was a key figure in the Lancastrian leadership of the Wars of the Roses. But I don't think she was ever formally kind of named as part of his council or his regent. These women, regardless of whether they had that formal title, some of them might not have actually been the dominant force in government. They were often ruling alongside councillors and other nobles. And then sometimes they maybe had a little bit more power, and then something would happen and it would kind of shift. So Margaret is named regent in 1513, and then she gets deposed, and then she never formally, as far as I remember, she never formally regains the title. She does insist for almost the rest of her life that she shouldn't have been deposed. And I'll go into that at the end because it's interesting, but it's a little bit of a segue. But Margaret remained kind of active in government throughout this period as part of this kind of ever shifting factional dynamic that included other prominent nobles, notably the Duke of Albany, who was James V's first cousin once removed, and then an even more distant relative, James Hamilton, the Earl of Arran. And in terms of like the idea of a queen regent, the motivation behind having let's put her in charge, there's kind of two main things. So firstly, princesses were highly educated in this era. They may not have received such an explicitly kind of scholarly education as princes, but they knew how to run households, which was economic literacy. They knew how to handle courtiers, they knew how to entertain diplomats and other kind of foreign attaches. They knew how to dissemble and use the avenues of power that were available to them. I think you could fairly say that they were understudies in how to rule a country. And then the kind of second key thing is, if you're a queen mother, especially one from a foreign kingdom, so Margaret obviously being from England, she had one undeniable advantage that meant she was going to be designated by her husband as the regent. Because after James IV died, Margaret owed everything to her son: her place at court, her finances, her welfare, where she was going to live. Her entire position, her status, her role in government depended on the fact that she was the mother of a king. By contrast, male regents who were serving on behalf of a child monarch were often given the role by virtue of their place in the succession. So the Duke of Albany and the Earl of Arran were both in the line of succession. If something happens to this child king, Margaret loses everything. She may well have to go back to England kind of with her tail between her legs. If something happens to the king, Albany and Hamilton stand to gain everything. So who would you designate as the regent for your literal infant son? Is it the one whose entire existence depends on that son being alive? Or is it those who are waiting in the wings if the son so much as coughed? There's lots of different contexts in which they emerged, but that is kind of the rationale. And you very often will have historians being surprised, like, oh, why would they name the woman? Because if their son died, they knew what happened with Richard III and all that shenanigans. They were like, we're not making that mistake again. So why wouldn't it be the consort? So as I kind of said, like, some of them had the title formally and some didn't. Joan Beaufort and Mary of Guelders, who I mentioned earlier, they are less known, partly because it's like Scotland is a little bit more peripheral, but they also ruled for a shorter period of time. Margaret of Austria, who, although she wasn't a queen, she ruled the Netherlands for several decades on and off. Even at some point, she was kind of fed up of it, but they were like, no, you have to stay. And the Netherlands actually continued to be governed by various Habsburg women throughout the 16th century, including Margaret's niece, Mary of Austria, and then the illegitimate daughter of Charles V, a woman named Margaret of Parma. So you have figures like that. And then in the later kind of 16th century, we have Margaret Tudor's daughter-in-law, Marie de Guise. So Marie de Guise married James V of Scotland. She's very well known in Scotland as very significant because she oversaw the rise of Protestantism in Scotland. And there is an argument to be made that she died quite suddenly in 1560, and if she hadn't died, Scotland may have remained Catholic at least for a little bit longer. But because Marie de Guise is the mother, the regent, the monarch on whose behalf she was serving was Mary Queen of Scots, who just grabs the headlines. So her mother kind of falls behind the wayside a little. She's definitely in Scottish historiography she's talked about, but most people wouldn't necessarily know that for much of Mary's life, the country was ruled by her mother. So including when she was in France, and Marie de Guise kind of set all of that up. She's a really interesting character. In terms of how successful were queen regents in terms of like the longevity of their rule, this ties into the question of marriage, because remarriage, the two almost inevitable things that ended a woman's regency were the monarch on whose behalf they were ruling becoming capable of rule, usually through growing up. So the age of majority did vary. I think in France it was 21, because when Anne de Beaujeu ruled on behalf of her brother, he was 18 or something. But in Scotland, it seemed to be kind of sometime in adolescence. But the other thing that could oust them was them remarrying. And for quite specific reasons in this context. So the kind of thing you need to know as background is that widowhood could be really great for medieval women. They were no longer kind of children under the thumb of their father. They were no longer wives under the thumb of their husbands. They were in charge of their family. And in the kind of lower classes, it could be quite a lucrative time. So widows often appear in kind of legal proceedings in their own right. Some of them ran businesses, including businesses that they had inherited from their husbands. And in some very rare instances, some of them were allowed to kind of continue guild membership after their husband's death. And in the higher classes, that they were the ones in charge of their own fate. But depending on the woman's age and kind of how lucrative a bride she was, there may be an expectation to remarry. So Margaret, as I said, she was only 23 when she was widowed, and she had options for a second marriage. But if she married abroad, she would have had to leave her son. And so she would have forfeited the regency that way. So yeah, so she might have had to end the regency by virtue of leaving. But the double-edged sword with widowhood and with remarriage is it was always going to compromise a woman's regency and her position in government. And this was basically the crux of my entire second chapter of my dissertation, and also a paper that I wrote on Mary Queen of Scots. So because wives were considered legally and socially under the control of their husbands, and if that woman had children from a previous marriage, if those children were children, hadn't ascertained kind of the age of majority, those husbands ruled over them too, over their stepchildren. Now, Margaret was not just a mother, she was the mother of the king, and she had a country to rule. And so by remarrying, the regent is putting that king and that country under the legal and social control of their second husband. And so this almost always puts a stop to the regency. It certainly did so with Margaret, and then it kind of did with Joan Beaufort. So I'm not as hot on the circumstances of her deposition, but she remarried to a Scottish noble a few years after James I died, and then she kind of got marginalised in ongoing factional shenanigans. But then I think she only lived kind of the 7 years, I think, after her husband died, whereas Margaret lived 1541, yeah. And then in terms of the leading on to marriage and control over who they married, so queens and princesses, etc., in this era their first marriages were almost never their own decisions. They were married for kind of political and diplomatic necessity. You will often see kind of an assumption that like, oh, everyone got married at 12 or 13. Regular people, no, they probably wouldn't get married until much later. But because these marriages were so important in kind of a political sense with the nobility, they would often get married a lot younger as well. I mean, you have stories of like, infants being married. They would not have lived with their spouse until they were teenagers, but it definitely wasn't their choice necessarily. It's kind of suggested that Margaret and James IV did get on quite well. But once she was widowed, she could, if a woman so wished, take the chance to kind of marry according to her own choosing. So Margaret did, and then quite famously, her younger sister Mary did. So Mary married the King of France, but he died a few months later. And then when Mary was coming back to England, Henry VIII's best friend Charles Brandon went to go and get part of the party that went and got her, and they got married on the way back because I think they kind of loved each other. Mary was absolutely besotted with him, and that was a whole drama. But it's interesting that both of them took the chance, Margaret and Mary, like, no, this is my decision now. And Mary's was less of a disaster. Margaret's was a complete disaster, but she didn't know that at the time. But as a result of these kind of remarrying and putting the regency under this random male noble, it meant that remarrying would almost always put your kind of regency in jeopardy. And Margaret did not accept this. It's usually said that James IV's will said Margaret is going to be the regent until she remarries, unless she remarries. And then you kind of get this like, oh, why did she remarry? Like, that's so stupid of her. I have yet to see or hear definitive primary source proof that his will said that. We don't have a copy of his will. It's always said in kind of secondary sources like that it said this, but everybody just references each other. I haven't ever found this is what the will says. So Margaret insisted for the rest, well, I don't know if it was quite for the rest of her life. I think she did give up eventually after James was older. But after being deposed, she was, no, his will made me the regent, therefore I am the regent. It is kind of moot because of this legal and social custom that made her retaining the regency while being the wife of Archibald Douglas impossible. But I think we can't rule out the possibility that Margaret was right. There's a sense sometimes that James IV was stupid for putting his trust in her. It is my belief, and this is slightly conjectural, but it is my belief that he thought she would do a good job, whether it was as the regent politically or just that she would look after their son. Maybe James hoped that she wouldn't remarry, but as I said, we don't know if he said that specifically, but that is something that is just really endears me to her. She made so many mistakes and she is so fallible and reminds us that these people were real people, like they're not characters in a book. But she was always attempting to protect her position in her son's government, whether that was for her own charge or, well, I don't think these are mutually exclusive. She may have wanted to be in charge, but she also likely wanted to protect her son. And she just never gave up. She maintained for the rest of his minority that she was entitled to a role in government. In 1514, when she was deposed the first time, she just ignored the council and she wouldn't hand over the Great Seal of the kingdom, to the point that the nobles in the minutes for this council, they had to consider getting a goldsmith to make a new one because she wouldn't hand it over. And she also, in the November of that year, I don't think it ever happened, but she was like, I'm holding a parliament. And the council had to issue a statement saying, please don't go to this woman's parliament. She has been ousted, which tells me that there were nobles who would have gone. She clearly enjoyed some support if they had to, they kind of protest too much. If they had to say, don't go to this parliament, it's completely unauthorized. Clearly people weren't thinking, oh, well, she's doing a terrible job. And she just always put her all into, even when things went wrong, even when she had her back against the wall and there was almost no chance of success. And I always kind of say that I think that it's one type of courage to risk everything for success and kind of lay it all out on the line for victory, but it's quite another to risk it all for failure. And I think she very much embodies the approach that the world is always trying to humble you, so why help? She is a disaster at times and she is very multifaceted and very much dismissed. And I would say that early kind of feminist scholarship would dismiss her as well. And I think Margaret, because she did adhere a lot of the time to patriarchal social norms and exploited it, kind of as we've said, she isn't a primary candidate feminist history, let's get Margaret Tudor in. Like, nobody is doing that. And my argument is she's still worthy of study, even if she's not a Catherine of Aragon figure. We love it when women rebel against gender in this era. It sells placemats and t-shirts and tote bags. But there were lots of other women who I think are just as interesting, but weren't really pushing back and breaking boundaries, but they're still worthy of study. And they can still tell us a lot about that period. That she can tell us about being a queen, about the role of motherhood and maternal imagery, like we were saying about the Annunciation. And you risk losing all of that repository of information that she can tell us, and other figures like her.
A really insightful way to wrap up the point. Sometimes history and studies, especially with marginalized communities, whether that be women or whatever community that really doesn't get any focus in history, you want an inspirational story. You want them to buy all odds, and you want to give them this benefit of the doubt in place modern ideals onto these people, but then you realize, especially with feminist study or women's history, that these are human people, they're fallible, and you're studying the way that they live their lives, and sometimes it's not going to go well. And it doesn't mean that their history is worthless. It doesn't mean that their story shouldn't be told. It's just a new light to examine it. And you're allowed to have fun with that. You're allowed to see their failures and still note it as a piece of history that should still be included.
Yeah, 100%. And I think we are, I think it is tailing off, but we've got a little while to go before we kind of are able to get through the Girlboss history. You know, the books you get, I don't know if you do this, whenever I'm in a bookshop and I see a book and it's like 100 inspirational women, and I do the Coco Chanel check. I'm like, if she's in there and you've not mentioned the fact that she was a massive Nazi, I'm not fucking with this book, essentially. So I think we are beyond, we're in academic circles, I think they're beyond that. And then in the kind of more public history space, where we're just out the door of leaving that behind. It's a defensive mechanism to produce these inspiring women. We don't have to justify and prove that in terms of women and other communities, we don't have to prove that they exist anymore. I mean, we might feel that we do, but we shouldn't have to. And so we don't need to justify ourselves. We don't need a smoking gun to prove that women are not inherently fickle and vain and stupid. And it's the same with kind of some of the queer history stuff I've done. We don't need to justify our existence and prove and have this smoking gun. Let's kind of divest ourselves of that impulse to defend women in history by just focusing on these kind of girl bosses.
So that's it for this episode of the Historians Hangout. Thank you so much, EK, for all of your research and help with this episode. I truly enjoyed having you on as a guest. For those interested, feel free to follow EK on her Instagram. It's like history. I promise you will not be disappointed. As always, the director, editor, and host of this hangout is me, Alana Graves. Thanks for listening. Bye!